It's now time to hear from our panel. I'm pleased to welcome Ernst Kossek, a social scientist and professor at Purdue University's Krannert School of Management. She's a pioneer in the work, family, life research field. Can't wait to get into it with her. William Spriggs, an old friend, the chief economist at the AFL-CIO, the largest group of labor unions in the United States, and Nicole Mason, president and CEO of the Institute for Women's Policy Research. She's sort of a legend in this field. She's called the pandemic a she session, referring to the devastating economic impact on women, and especially women of color. It's really great to be with you all. Ellen, let me start with you and kind of look at this question as we try to disaggregate, put the pieces together of the future of workplace. And in my mind, I mean, maybe I'm getting it wrong, I sort of look at that as what are our social responsibilities around that question, particularly when it comes to, inclusion and equity. And I just did a program yesterday where I'm looking on kind of the growing inequality in this country, and what do we do, this goes to William's area in a way, but what do we do to make sure that as we are in this inflection point, that inequality begins to decrease over time? I'd just love to get your dashboard on what some of the levers are in there that we could move.
Well, I think that work-life inequality is a growing form of job inequality. I just wrote an article for Harvard Business Review on the future of flexibility. And as we saw during the pandemic, we had forced flexibility of quarantining for those that could telework, and the essential workers, frontline workers, the nurses, the people in the grocery stores didn't have it. So I would hope in our strategies going forward, whether it's education, as the Congresswoman spoke about before, or the workplace, that we are more flexible for all types of workers. We haven't placed a premium on flexibility for essential workers. And then also, I believe that for telework, there's a real risk that it could set women back if they are greater users of remote work and using flexibility more, as we've seen with time out for maternity leave. It could affect wages, labor force retention, and their ability to rise in the workplace.
So, Ellen, before I leave you, but do you think these patterns that have kind of taken shape so quickly during the pandemic, are they going to stay that way without us sort of deliberately moving them back? I'm just sort of, you sort of saw the scramble society went through, right, as it went online. Like half of our team here, I don't know where they are all around the country. They're fine there. It's different than what you just talked about frontline and essential workers who are in a different space. So I'm just wondering if it's just because we're early in this, we're seeing, I would call it perhaps unhealthy patterns, or do you think they're stuck that way and we actually have to legislate or create norms and habits that are different?
Oh, I think we're at a fundamental point where we have the potential to transform how we deal with labor in this country, or we could step back. So, for example, the United Kingdom, Australia, and some other countries have the right to request a flexible work schedule as a basic right, and then the employer can say, I can accommodate you or not. And it's available to all workers, not just people with children. We are so behind on work-life policy. We don't have national statistics that are very good and access to flexibility. And as we saw during the pandemic, this is what people needed to do to keep their paychecks and care for their family, or to keep a job and stay home when they were sick.
William, you and I have talked about this before, in this time we're at. I talked to the White House Chief of Staff the other day, and he said, when they came into office, they were making 50,000 jobs a month. Now we're making 500,000 jobs a month. But when I kind of look at that out there, and I look at the big jobs gap out there, and how do we take this moment when labor's got an edge and make it matter? What are your thoughts?
Not so sure we have an edge. I think what we have is a very diminished labor force. And to follow up on Ellen's point, the United States has vastly underinvested in the public infrastructure needed to get women to work, and fairly. So if you look back in the 1980s, the United States led. We had higher women's labor force participation. We had lower gaps between men and women in terms of earnings than typical. Now, the United States is last. We are sixth among the 7th largest economies in terms of women's labor force participation. And the pay gap faced by American women is larger than women in any other industrial country. The only other country that's worse than us is South Korea. And all that has to do with what you hear from business people. We can't solve the child care problem. we cannot get women's labor force participation in the United States to fit what's necessary for the 21st century until we make the public investment in elder care and in child care. And we cannot go forward as a competitive nation or continue to grow in this century because our birth rate is slowing. The growth of our labor force is growing. We cannot sustain our current economy unless we get women's labor force participation back to where it was at the end of the 20th century. So we can't recover from this downturn until we get women's labor force participation back up. The people people keep saying, well, they're not coming to work. It's the women in the service sector aren't coming to work because we haven't solved this problem. And we learn from this downturn, we have to have paid leave. The key factor for why American women have the biggest gap, the biggest gender gap in any industrialized nation, despite their high level of education, despite being more educated than men, despite being the majority of the workforce, is because we don't have paid leave.
Well, William, how do you make
Only women in America get punished.
Right.
Only women in America. No other industrialized nation. No other industrialized nation.
So, William, how do we respond to Senator Manchin, who said the math doesn't add up, that we've not squared our other entitlement programs, and that before we add another, what he calls an entitlement program, we have to do it? I'm just interested in the response. I was sort of interested in the White House not actually saying, hey, let's talk about entitlement programs that we have in place to get his support for paid leave, because he's asking a mathematical question in a way. So what is the answer to that mathematical equation?
The president paid for everything that was in his proposal. So the United States can afford this. The president laid bare there are resources that can be fairly taxed in the United States. And so this is not an issue of can we afford it, but it is an issue, can we afford not to do it? We cannot go forward in this century with a slowing growth of the workforce unless we get women's labor force participation rate up. This is what Japan learned. This is what Germany learned, which is why they were way behind us, both in terms of the pay gap and women's labor force participation. They made the investments in childcare. They have paid leave, and now they surpassed us. This is the simple arithmetic. The simple arithmetic is your nation grows based on labor force and productivity. If labor force shrinks, then you're only relying on productivity, and no nation makes it only on productivity. That's why everybody else is figuring out how do we get labor force up.
Well, thank you. Well, Nicole, I want to say a couple of things about you. You were just named recently as one of the world's 50 greatest leaders by Fortune magazine. And so, I don't always read Fortune, but I'll take their word on it. You're the author of Born Bright, A Young Girl's Journey from Nothing to Something in America. I'm always interested in this. How do we enrich human capital in this country? How do we take talent that's been left on the sidelines and bring it in? How do we create a healthier and more inclusive economy? And I'm just sort of interested, whenever I talk to someone, what are the priorities you think we need to reshuffle to get that picture right?
Well, I think that we really need to think about, answer the question why we haven't been able to create a more inclusive environment, economy. And when we do that, the answer becomes quite clear. It's the things that we haven't been doing. So we haven't had a, robust childcare infrastructure. We don't have paid leave. We don't, people don't earn living wages. There's an enormous pay gap. So when we think, when we think about our education system, K to 12, it's failing a huge chunk of America, our young people. And so all these things together point us in the direction of why we don't have an inclusive economy, in addition to many of the things that both Ellen and Bill said. So, thank you for bringing up Born Bright. But, the thing about it is that, my journey seems exceptional to many people,
right.
But the truth of the matter is that it shouldn't be exceptional. Right. All people, all kids, all children should have equal access to opportunity. And right now, that's just not the case.
No, I really appreciate that. And I totally agree with you. I often think about how do we go and create scale in these stories so that they're not boutiques and they look like more the pattern that we should be ascribing, trying to rise to. But before that, let's talk about the She Session. Tell us about the She Session and what the implications are, not only what's happening, but, as William and Ellen were talking about, as you look forward, right? I always say, okay, 2 or 3 years from now, when we get all together again, what will we be looking at if we didn't fix this She Session?
Well, I think it'll look like what Bill and both Ellen said, lower labor force participation among women. Women will struggle to re-enter the workforce, less career mobility, less earnings. There are very clear consequences to not acting. And I just want to, you didn't pose the question to me, but I'm going to, say something about it anyway. This whole idea about the math doesn't add up, or I need to see the math on this, is just a red herring. It is actually not true and takes us off our path of really creating a, robust care infrastructure and getting workers the paid sick leave that we know, especially during the pandemic, would have made a difference. And so when I think about the recovery and a true recovery, one that, is equitable, inclusive, these are the things we know need to happen. For example, if we think about women's labor force participation, if women in the U.S. Had the labor force participation rate of women in Norway, because they have subsidized childcare, be $1.6 trillion to the economy, and the GDP. And so, there are definite benefits. It might cost us in the short term, but the benefits, long-term benefits in labor force participation, productivity, all the things that businesses and corporations say they care about would come to pass if we were able to enact some of these policies that we are saying will make a difference, not only for women workers, but for all workers and the economy and also businesses.
Look, I think the answer to Senator Manchin is something along those lines. We didn't hear it, actually. We haven't. He's asking a question, but kind of look at the question of how do you generate growth? How do you bring talent to the table? The more you have these people in, the more the places. That's sort of the answer there, right? So, but I just wanted to put it on the table because that's the question he posed out there, and I haven't heard this town, maybe this town is the dysfunctional place that doesn't answer questions. People just broadcast, but it's part of the mix here. But let me ask you all a question that's on my mind right now as we sort of struggle with a very large gap in jobs and in employment. And the question is, we think about the future of the workplace. Is the workplace as we've constructed it decent enough to people that they want to come back to work? Because one of the things I've been interested in is people have kind of looked at their lives and said, what do I care about, right? A lot of people said they're not coming back because they're not being paid enough, or they're being paid so much by the government they're not coming back. But I think there's some dimension of it that people are looking at the equities they care about in their life and whether or not they come back. And I'm just interested in this moment of whether or not there is, to Ellen, you're kind of touching on it, whether we have an opportunity to rewrite things in a better way. And I know it sounds naive, but to leapfrog into a more inclusive place that's more fair and decent to people, like William was kind of saying, America's the only place where women are penalized, in this way. And so I guess right now I'm just wondering, maybe it's naive to begin envisioning a leapfrog into something better, because we clearly have this moment when people are reevaluating, I think, their relationship with work.
I agree. And I also think there are many forms of diversity that will be affected positively in the long run. So, for example, aging workforce is a real issue in the United States. We're going to be bankrupt. If you look at like a country like Brazil, you have a pyramid where you have lots of young people working and older people as they retire up above, taking out of safety net. We are like an inverse triangle where we have fewer young people working or people working longer, and we're going to bankrupt social programs because we have so many people 60s, 70s not working. So we want to make people want to work longer. We have this aging workforce. We have the fertility rates that are declining. If we look long term, I saw stats that said like 80% of Americans want things like paid leave. And so
Right.
I think it's just how do we pay for it? And we just have to make it a priority. We haven't made work-life issues and stress a priority in this country. And it's affecting labor force participation and the economy.
Well, thank you. I'll quote my friend Nancy Lamont at AARP, who said the future of retirement, unfortunately, is work. But William, your thoughts?
The thing that makes me grind my teeth, this discussion about we can't find truck drivers.
Right.
In California, they did a study of the excess deaths, the unexpected large increase in deaths by occupation. And what they found was there was a 28% increase in deaths in transportation and warehousing. So you hear people say, I can't find truck drivers, and you go, are you the most insensitive people on the planet? Did you not send flowers to the funerals? Did you not send a note of condolence? Did you not care that your workers died? If you have 28% excess deaths, that's like 3% of the labor force just disappeared. Of course you have a shortage. And the fact that people are saying there's a shortage without commenting on the deaths from COVID, this is why American workers are upset. Because even their employers don't even pause enough.
I'm so
to
glad
look at the 750,000 Americans who died from this disease and pause long enough to say, wow, I lost a lot of workers to this disease.
I'm so glad you raised that.
Not even mention it.
No, I'm so glad you raised it. It's a huge issue. We act too many places, I'll have to say even in media, as if there's no cost to all of the people we've lost in this nation around the world. William, thank you so much for sharing that. Nicole, let me give you the last word, and then we're going to take a question from the audience.
So I just want to say that I actually am really energized by this moment. Many people have called this moment the Great Resignation, and there's a lot of hand-wringing about people leaving the workforce and, blaming workers and saying, intimating that people are being lazy or just don't want to return to work. But really, actually, what we're seeing is a great renegotiation and a rebalancing, of people's priorities. Again, really, asking employers to engage differently. Flexibility is the new currency. And so really thinking about what does that mean? How might our workplace models change to reflect what's happening and what has happened over the last, year and a half? I think some employers think they can just wait it out and we'll go back to normal. But the news is that we cannot unring that bell. We're here and we're going to have to deal with this reality. Or, workers are going to say, I'm not coming back. I don't want to work at a place where I don't have paid sick leave, because we know that makes a difference for workers, in this economy and because of the pandemic. Childcare flexibility, women have been talking about this as an issue for decades. And now we know that actually productivity does not drop when people work remotely. And so, now women have another different talking point to talk about the importance of flexibility. But to Ellen's point, we have to make sure that women don't get penalized for seeking out remote schedules. So I'm actually energized by this moment, brought on by this, a horrible crisis where we've lost a lot of Americans. But I do think employers need to get with the program and think about how they are talking and thinking about these issues.
Thank you. Let me squeeze in a quick question from the audience. We have Beth. Beth?
Hi, my name is Beth Noworotsky. I'm an employment advisor for the Co-op and Career Center at the Rochester Institute of Technology, RIT, in Rochester, New York. Our team supports the talented deaf and hard of...
We just lost Beth. I'm gonna finish her question as I have a transcript here, that they support the talented deaf and hard of hearing students and graduates for career opportunities. We also work to bring diversity and inclusion to the workplace. Thanks for talking about this great topic today. My question for you is, what does this trend look like for people with disabilities? Can you tell us more in depth about it? William, your thoughts?
We constantly have problems with new technologies and whether they're adaptable for different people. I mean, those who have vision impairments often have a hard time accessing new technologies because they really are designed assuming that you can see. And regrettably, a lot of them are designed assuming that you can hear. And so we're going to have to fight to make sure that technologies that advance productivity are going to be accessible to all workers and we don't leave people behind. This is one of the great challenges. And, we're talking about a new metaverse where we will interact with the internet in a different way. But that's so predicated on a concept of someone who sees and hears and can move in the three-dimensional space as someone who can see and hear. So these are the challenges we have before us. We have to keep them forefront all the time.
So Ellen and Nicole, I've only got 30 seconds each, and we're right at the end of the program, but I would love to get your quick thoughts because I think it's an important question from Beth. So Nicole?
Sorry. I think it is a really good question. And as we grapple with building a more inclusive economy, but also inclusive workforce, many of these issues that have been left on the table, whether it's, making sure that workplaces are inclusive and, inclusive of, deaf and hard of hearing or people with other disabilities. Again, we are in this moment where we can be very thoughtful about how our workplaces adapt to not only women, but, other workers as well, and also our federal and state level policies.
I really totally agree. Ellen, I'm going to give the last word to you.
Well, and the number of people in this country with disabilities is growing. Think about mental health issues, people with many forms of challenges and going to an established workplace. This is another strategy to keep more people working in the labor force, and it could also improve the mental health of our country as well, to be more flexible. We need to just think about, as Nicole said, new models of work and move toward an article I've written on balanced flexibility. Things have shifted so much to the employer side that we haven't thought about how to help workers have a balanced say in how they live their lives and work every day.
Well, it's a big agenda, and this was I feel like we hit some topics that we don't get to talk about enough in this time. I'm really grateful to Ernst Kossek from Purdue University's Cranert School of Management, William Spriggs, Chief Economist at the AFL-CIO, and I want to say I talked to Liz Schuler, the first female president of the AFL-CIO in the AFL's history. It was a great honor to do that, but she's also part of the equation, so William, great to see you as well. And Nicole Mason, President and CEO of the Institute for Women's Policy Research. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks.